remember the night the truth came crashing down on me. It was winter in Ohio, the kind that makes you question why you ever chose to live in this corner of the country. Snow piled over the curbs and the wind carried with it knives of cold sharp enough to slit hope open. Friends, you enjoy listening to stories, but you don't subscribe to the channel or like the videos. I request you to please subscribe to the channel right now so that I get more motivation to bring you even more stories. If you help me reach 1,000 subscribers, I promise to bring you extremely best stories with a truly real feel, so go ahead, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and now let's move on to today's story. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the freeze I felt inside when I opened that letter. The bank official's words were polite but merciless. Our savings were gone, our investments dissolved, and the so-called guaranteed returns were nothing more than a cruel trick. The man behind it all, David Kane, had vanished, leaving families like mine bankrupt, futures shredded like waste paper. I sat in the kitchen staring at that letter until the clock struck midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2. My kids, Ethan and Lily, slept upstairs, trusting that their mother would always keep them safe, secure, and cared for. That trust was the rope around my neck as I tried to figure out how to break the news to them that their college fund was gone, their future swallowed by a smiling devil in a designer suit. Ethan was 17 then. Almost a man, but still young enough to believe that life had some kind of fairness running through its veins. When I told him the next morning, his first look wasn't anger, it was confusion. He blinked, like maybe I had said the words wrong. Lily just cried. She was 15, all dreams of music schools and art scholarships. And now, I had nothing to give her but a broken promise. The house fell heavy with silence after that. Dinner conversations dried up. Ethan started working extra shifts at the gas station just to feel like he still had some control. Lily locked herself in her room for hours. I swear I could hear her crying into her pillow, but when I knocked she always said she was fine. And me? I sank. I'd sit in the car after work staring at my hands on the steering wheel, numb with the weight of what I had lost for them. I hated myself. More than that, I hated him. David Kane. The name pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat of poison. At first, I told myself that justice would find him. That the law would track him down, the courts would punish him, and we'd get some piece of our lives back. But weeks turned into months, and the news reports shifted from outrage to mere afterthoughts. Kane had pulled off one of the slickest white-collar stampedes America had ever seen, and the FBI had nothing but smoke in their hands. Justice wasn't coming. Not from them. And every day my children spiraled further into despair, I knew the only justice left would have to come from me. One night, sitting in that darkened kitchen alone, I whispered it out loud for the first time. I will make him pay. The words shocked me with the steadiness of my own voice. It didn't even tremble. I wasn't the kind of woman who had ever hurt anyone. My life was built on rules, stability, structure. But those rules had been used like a weapon against me. That man had stolen money, yes. But worse, he had stolen futures. My children's futures. And for that, there could be no forgiveness. That night, I opened my laptop and searched for everything I could on David Kane, his old business associates, his family's name, his habits. Most articles were empty shells. But scattered in between, I caught glimpses: an old conference attended in New York, rumors of properties under false names in Florida, a club membership in Las Vegas. Breadcrumbs. And I decided I would follow them. I didn't know exactly how I would destroy him. But I knew one thing: when the day came that my children smiled again, it would be because their mother had done what no lawyer, no cop, and no court of law could do. I wasn't going to wait for justice anymore. I was going to build it with my own two hands. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who could keep two lives running at once. But that's what I became. By day, I was still the mother who packed lunches, folded laundry, and pushed my exhausted kids through high school exams. By night, I was something else altogether. In the quiet after midnight, when the house was still and Ethan's soft snores drifted down the hallway, I transformed into a strategist. My old laptop, chipped at the corners from years of use, became the engine of my second life. I scoured message boards, read articles on fraud cases, even buried myself in forums made for private investigators. It was there that I learned two crucial lessons. First, men like David Cain never disappear completely. Second, their greatest weakness is always their ego. Ego. That was David Cain's weapon and also his tell. Every smiling photo of him at charity galas, every smug interview he'd given before his empire collapsed, even his flashy way of throwing phrases like family values into speeches about wealth accumulation, it all reeked of a man who needed the world to gaze at him in awe. He couldn't live in the shadows forever. A man like him would eventually crawl back out to remind the world of his brilliance. So I decided to go digging into his trail, the kind that men like him thought no one cared enough to chase. I started with his associates. Men who once sat beside him on investor panels, women who posed for glossy magazine features about power couples of Wall Street. Most were silent now, burying the stains of having ever known him. But silence can sometimes point to truth. I sensed where hesitation lurked, where carefully chosen no comments meant there was something worth hiding. Still, I needed more. So I swallowed my pride and drove 2 towns over to the public library, where no one knew me, and opened up old business directories. Cain's companies had folded, but there were connections, shell corporations, obscure LLCs in Delaware, funny little addresses that led nowhere but looked legitimate on paper. One name led to another. Slowly, a web began to take shape. And then I found it. Buried in tax filings from years before, one property kept surfacing. It was never in his name directly, too obvious. But cross-check it enough, and Cain's fingerprints were there. A real estate deal in Naples, Florida. A waterfront property, tucked away under a company name that looked like pure nonsense. Naples. Sunshine, yachts, golf courses. It made sense. A man like him would never run to the shadows of Detroit or Akron. No, he'd want a place where palms lined the streets and everyone wore sunglasses thick enough to hide their sins. That night, I closed the laptop and just sat still for a long while. The old me would have stopped there. Maybe printed the evidence and dropped it off at some agency. But the mother in me, the one who had watched her daughter cry herself to sleep, who had counted her son's blistered palms after endless hours at the gas station, that mother hadn't come this far to hand her revenge over to anyone else. No. This wasn't going to be an arrest story. This was going to be my story. So I started preparing. I withdrew small amounts of money, bit by bit, so the bank wouldn't ask questions. I didn't tell Ethan or Lily what I was doing, not yet. To them, I smiled, acted like things were softening, even took an extra weekend shift to make it believable. But in the locked drawer of my desk, I kept what was becoming my arsenal, printed financial trails, a map of Naples with property lines, and a small notebook where I wrote everything about David Cain. His schedule. His patterns. His weaknesses. One line I underlined 3 times. Take from him what he took from them: future, pride, security. I wasn't fully sure what that meant in practical terms yet. All I knew was that the man who had left me and my children suffocating in despair was going to know what it felt like to lose everything that made him feel invincible. And when I finally stepped into his world, I wasn't going as the woman who had sat helplessly in her Ohio kitchen repeating the words, "Why me?" I was going as something else, something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. Not a victim. A hunter. The first time I drove into Naples, Florida, it felt like I had stepped into a postcard someone had painted too beautifully to be real. Palm trees bent slightly in the coastal breeze, boulevards shimmered with boutiques and cafes, and behind the layers of tinted glass, I could feel the hush of wealth lurking everywhere. I should have felt out of place. A woman from suburban Ohio with a dented second-hand car and 3 changes of clothes packed into the trunk, but instead, I felt oddly invisible. And invisibility was power, especially in a place where people wear their money like cologne, thick and choking, announcing themselves at every corner. The address I had scribbled in my notebook led me to a gated community along the water. The kind of houses where driveways stretched wide enough to fit 3 cars side by side. The kind of places built not just to shield people from the world, but to declare victory over it. Cain lived here. Or so I believed. I couldn't get through those gates, of course, not at first. But I didn't need to. Beyond the walls, I could always find what I wanted because wealthy men crave being seen. They go to restaurants where seating outdoors guarantees an audience, they play golf at courses where membership means being photographed, they attend fundraisers where showing off is expected. So I started watching. Day 1, I parked 2 blocks away from the community gates. A man with a car like his, it didn't take long to spot. A silver Range Rover, windows darkened, the kind of vehicle that announces confidence without quite sinking into vulgarity. I followed him once, carefully, nervously, my hands tightening on the steering wheel with every turn. And there he was. David Cain. Older than before, maybe, but not beaten down. His face still wore that same cruelly charming smile, the kind of smile that once convinced me and hundreds of others that he was trustworthy. He had traded his Manhattan suits for polo shirts and a tan, but the arrogance, that part never aged. My heart slammed so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Seeing him in the flesh after months of late-night obsession was almost unbearable. He looked like a man celebrating early retirement, savoring his stolen riches, free from consequence. I wanted to run at him that moment, to scream, to tell the world who he really was. But no, I reminded myself, revenge done too quickly burns out like flash paper. True revenge, lasting revenge, is crafted slowly. So I watched. Each day, I learned a new detail. He played tennis on Tuesdays with the same couple. He favored a seafood restaurant on 5th Avenue South, always ordering oysters and bourbon. He had no wife with him anymore, but there was a woman, brunette, younger, one who laughed too loud and clung to him as if she already knew he offered money more than loyalty. Twice a week, he withdrew cash from an ATM. Always around $2,000. It was almost laughable. This man who had destroyed so many families walked around with complete belief in his own safety. He thought the world had forgotten. But I hadn't. Those nights in my rented room in a broken-down motel miles from the waterfront, I rehearsed scenarios. How to approach him. How to strip him down piece by piece. Part of me wanted spectacle, to drag his sins into the open, rip that mask off for everyone to see. Another part craved something quieter, darker. To tear at the foundation of his life so stealthily that by the time he noticed, it was already gone. One night, staring into the cracked motel mirror, I whispered to myself. You don't just kill him. You kill what he loves, control, respect, money. Because death would be too kind. Too swift. No. Cain needed to feel the crawling despair he had given my children. That helplessness of watching a future collapse while the world moves on, indifferent. The plan wasn't fully shaped yet, but it was alive now, beating its way out of me like a second heart. And when I saw Cain again, laughing at his own joke while waiters scrambled to please him, I realized something strange. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The woman who once trusted his promises was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone whose entire existence had narrowed into one singular purpose. Not survival. Retribution. It started small. I knew better than to go charging in all at once. Men like David Cain didn't flinch at drama, they thrived on it. No, what unsettled them most was the quiet, inexplicable unraveling of control. And I intended to cut one thread at a time until his whole life collapsed under its own weight. My opportunity came sooner than I thought. Watching him week after week, I noticed something. For all his arrogance, Cain still ran certain habits himself. The man who had stolen millions was too proud to hand his errands over to anyone else. He withdrew his own cash. He handled his own car. He insisted on showing his dates that he tipped big with his own wallet. That vanity made him vulnerable. So one afternoon, I followed him to the little bank kiosk he used. I parked far enough not to raise suspicion and simply watched. Numbers matter to me. I catch details even when I don't try. Twice that week he withdrew almost the exact same amount, $2,000. Always crisp, always in cash. What if those withdrawals didn't go as smoothly next time? Back at the motel, I stayed up until the neon clock flashed 3 a.m. researching the systems banks use, skimming public records, digging into secondary sites meant for fraud prevention. I wasn't a hacker, not in the Hollywood sense. But I didn't need to be one. There were plenty of legal cracks, call lines, identity verification failures, all the tiny windows people trusted too much. And David Cain wasn't as careful as he thought. While digging, I uncovered the basics of his shell company, the one tied to his Naples property. Open records showed old contact info still attached to his accounts. A throwaway email. A phone registration. Enough that if someone wanted to shake the confidence of a man living on phantom accounts, it wouldn't be impossible. So I did. Nothing big, not yet. I placed a few anonymous calls posing as verification agents, locked up one of his credit cards for suspicion of irregular charges, and triggered a hold on his ATM access for security review. By the time Cain walked up to that ATM the next Tuesday, the smirk he usually carried melted into something else entirely, confusion. He shoved his card in once, twice, a third time, then slammed his fist lightly against the side of the machine before storming off. I sat in my car half a block away, watching through the windshield, and for the first time since the nightmare began, I felt something close to joy. Not satisfaction yet. Not relief. But joy, pure and raw, that the man who had made my children believe they were powerless was finally being toyed with. It was small, like pushing over the first domino. But small was enough. Small meant he could feel his grip slipping without knowing why. Over the next 2 weeks, I leaned in further. A canceled dinner because his preferred card didn't clear. A delayed shipment of wine he had apparently ordered from France, conveniently backlogged due to unverified payment. Even his luxury SUV refused him once when the system glitched at the gas station, thanks to me placing a tip-off that his card was being used without authorization. They were tiny inconveniences. Nothing fatal, nothing blaring, but constant. And for a man like Cain, constant friction was unacceptable. I could see it in his posture when he walked out of the upscale restaurant, his jaw tight, his hands twitching to grab his phone and demand the world obey again. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that the world wasn't random anymore. The world was me. In those moments, I wasn't the grieving mother in an Ohio kitchen. I wasn't the broke widow punching the numbers of overdue bills into a calculator late at night. I was the shadow in his blind spot. And shadows, if you feed them patience, can grow to swallow everything. This was just the beginning. The thing about men like David Cain is that their wealth is only half the story. Money buys security, but image, that's the crown jewel. Without admiration, without the performance of power, they aren't themselves anymore. So after weeks of tugging at his daily comforts, I decided to go for his mask. His respectability. His reputation. It wasn't difficult. The trail of destruction he'd left behind was a graveyard filled with families like mine. They weren't hard to find if you knew where to look. Old articles from New York, archived interviews with victims who had lost everything, message boards where scared retirees traded horror stories about Kane's schemes. Dozens of voices swallowed by time, all raging against the machine that had let him slip through its cracks. Voices no one had listened to anymore. But I listened. And then I gave them a stage again. Using a fresh identity I had cobbled together, a fake name, a fabricated online profile polished enough to appear real, I started reaching out. I claimed to be an independent journalist investigating white-collar fraud cases. At first, people hesitated. Survivors like us always do. But the moment I mentioned David Kane's name, silence melted into fury. They remembered. Oh, they remembered. One woman in Boston told me she still worked double shifts at a diner because Kane had stolen her retirement funds. Another from Phoenix confessed her son had to drop out of college when their savings disappeared. Each story was a dagger sharpened for my eventual use. I compiled them, carefully. Every quote, every detail, every name. I made a neat digital portfolio dressed like an exposé. Pictures, timelines, bank records pulled from old articles, it wasn't hard to weave into a narrative that looked professional, legitimate. And then I did the simplest thing of all. I leaked it. I sent it directly to the board of his upscale golf club. To the managing partners of restaurants he frequented. To real estate agents who catered to that pristine Naples community. No explanation. Just facts. Just Kane's past, served without garnish. The ripple was immediate. The next Thursday, I sat outside the seafood restaurant where he usually laughed the loudest at his own jokes. He showed up with the brunette woman on his arm, confident as always, but I saw it happen. The maitre d', normally eager, hesitated just a beat too long before greeting him. A flicker of recognition, a tightening at the corners of the man's mouth. Inside, a couple at the next table whispered. I couldn't hear them, but their glances carried weight. Kane noticed too. I could tell by the shift of his body, that forced laugh that sounded a little thinner than usual. It worked. For the first time since Naples, Kane looked over his shoulder. And then the woman, his brunette distraction, stormed off mid-dinner, tossing her napkin onto the table. I didn't know why, but I didn't need to. Maybe she'd Googled his name. Maybe she'd been warned by someone in her circle. All I knew was that Kane barely touched his oysters that night. The man who once thrived on being adored had been nudged towards something he hated most, recognition not as a genius investor, but as a con artist. I sat out there in my car, my hands wrapped tight around the steering wheel, and I whispered the words I hadn't dared before. I can break him. Because now I knew, it was working. But it wasn't enough for him to feel whispers at the edges of his life. No. I had to drag him into the same suffocating panic he had left me and my children in. I had to peel back his control, layer by layer, until all that was left was the naked truth of his powerless, desperate core. The cracks had begun. Now, I would turn them into collapse. If there's one truth I learned watching David Kane, for men like him, money is oxygen. They can live without affection, loyalty, maybe even family, but take away their ability to flash cash, and you take away their air. So that's where I went next. The good thing about chasing fraudsters is that they leave a trail, even when they think they don't. Kane had built his empire on lies, but money, even dirty money, has to live somewhere. Banks, shell corporations, brokers who pretend not to ask questions, as much as he tried to scatter it, those streams always pulled into a few predictable rivers. I started small, digging into public real estate filings like I had back in Ohio. Naples wasn't his only bolt hole. Through the same shadow company tied to his waterfront house, I traced 2 more property purchases in Florida, one near Miami, another tucked away further north. Neither in his name, of course. But connections were uncanny, identical filing agents, same obscure LLC names reused like old tricks, even recycled office addresses that didn't exist anymore. All it would take was the right nudge to make those houses radioactive. Posing again as my independent journalist persona, I ceded tips to financial watchdog blogs, attaching just enough detail to catch attention. Property flipping, offshore laundering, old fraud cases quietly resurfacing, all with just enough true detail about Kane to make the smoke look like fire. Within a week, whispers about David Kane hiding assets in Naples crawled their way online. And whispers online have a way of bleeding into reality. When I watched him slam his phone on the outdoor bar counter one evening, face flushed red while the bartender looked away nervously, I knew something had reached him. Then came the allies. Kane, despite his arrogance, still needed handlers, lawyers, tax men, brokers. I made it my job to cut his lifelines one by one. A simple email to his attorney's firm about past malpractice, anonymously delivered, backed up with enough grainy evidence to spook their compliance department, resulted in the attorney's sudden withdrawal from his partnership. His broker went silent not long after, undoubtedly spooked by the chatter multiplying online. And men like Kane? They notice every retreat. Every door that stops opening. Every call that goes unanswered. One night, I caught him pacing outside his Naples mansion. Phone pressed to his ear, voice raised enough I could catch a few stray words through the wind. Ridiculous, no grounds, they all knew the risks. He looked smaller in that moment. Not the magnetic predator who destroyed my family's future. No, he looked exactly like what he really was. A liar scrambling to hold together the fragile empire he'd built on other people's gullibility. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. Because this wasn't just about pulling apart his comfort, it was about cornering him into that desperate place where he understood, bone deep, the kind of despair we'd lived with since the day he stole our dreams. The kind of despair that leaves your daughter crying into her pillow at night. That leaves your son rough with exhaustion, barely able to keep his eyes open in class because he's been working a grown man's job. I wanted David Kane to know that kind of despair. And now he was close. It didn't take long before Kane started to realize his world was shrinking. The shimmer of confidence I first saw in Naples was gone. He still wore the polo shirts, still drove the spotless SUV, still tried to swagger when he walked into restaurants, but the cracks showed. The way he glanced at his phone every 5 minutes. The clipped way he snapped at waiters now. The ever-present twitch at his jaw. He knew something was wrong. But he didn't know it was me. Not yet. I decided it was time he felt my presence, not enough to give myself away, but enough to plant the seed that he was not as untouchable as he believed. The first time, it was subtle. I left an envelope on the hood of his Range Rover while he laughed too loud inside a high-end bar. No return address, no handwriting tying it back to me. Inside, just a single piece of paper. I know what you took. I know who you ruined. Nothing else. No threats. No signature. Just fact. I watched from down the street as he returned to his car. He froze when he saw the envelope, glanced around, even tried to laugh at it as if it were some meaningless prank. But when he slid into the driver's seat, the laughter stopped. His face hardened. Chest heaving. He read the note twice, 3 times, his eyes darting left and right as if someone were about to step out of the shadows to drag him away. Perfect. The second time, I escalated. At the seafood place, I had a copy of one of those old newspaper clippings, the kind naming him as the mastermind of the investment scam, delivered to his table by a waiter. The server mumbled that it must have been a mix-up. But Kane's hands trembled as he snatched it up, shoved it into his jacket, and stormed out, leaving half his plate untouched. The third was my favorite. I followed him to the tennis courts he played every Tuesday. While he showered afterward, I slipped into the locker room. All I left was a small card in the pocket of his tennis bag. Plain white, nothing extravagant. Just 5 words handwritten, sharp enough to slice through whatever piece he still carried. You can't run forever. This time, when he left the club, his swagger was gone completely. He looked over his shoulder not once but 3 times, his eyes scanning the parking lot with the nervous twitch of prey. And that was when I finally allowed myself the smallest taste, standing across the street, in the shadow of a palm tree, watching. For just a second, his gaze caught on me. Nothing obvious. Just a flicker, as if he sensed someone standing still while the rest of the world moved. He squinted, stepped forward, and before he could dare to cross the road, I turned away, sliding into the crowd of tourists. Disappearing. But I knew he'd felt me. He didn't just have enemies online anymore. He didn't just have frozen accounts or whispers about his past. He had something worse. Something a man like him couldn't fathom. A hunter. By the time I returned to my motel that night, my hands were trembling, not with fear but with adrenaline. For months I had dreamed of this moment, of turning the man who had ruined my life into the one lying awake in the dark, hearing every faint sound as the footstep of someone coming for him. That night, I slept well for the first time in years. Because David Kane finally knew. He wasn't safe anymore. I'd studied men like David Kane long enough to know how they respond when hunted. They don't crumble right away. Not men like him. Their first instinct is always control, hit back, intimidate, reassert dominance. And, right on cue, Kane tried to fight the shadows. It began one morning outside his mansion. I was parked at a distance, sipping coffee from a paper cup, when I saw 2 unfamiliar men at his gate, stocky, wide-shouldered, the kind who make a living convincing others their trouble. Private security. A desperate move. He thought he could buy protection the same way he had bought silence years ago. But it was already too late for that. That evening, as I tracked him to a quiet cigar lounge, I saw him lean across a mahogany table toward one of Naples' few private investigators. His gestures were sharp, urgent. I knew the type, ex-cop, no nonsense, someone Kane thought money could sway. I imagined the conversation in my head, find out who's harassing me. I don't care what it costs. The irony made me smile. He thought money could solve it. But his money was already slipping like sand through his fingers, and I held the hourglass. I let him play his game. I even let the investigator trail me once. I noticed the tail, a car that stayed a little too long behind me on a rainy Thursday. I led him in lazy circles, through suburban streets, into a grocery store where I strolled the aisles pushing an empty cart. When I finally cut him off by ducking into an underground parking garage, I could almost feel the frustration dripping off him. Good. Let him think I was a ghost. Let them chase a shadow they could never catch. Kane grew more erratic by the week. He stopped going to the same restaurants, instead hopping randomly, trying to stay unpredictable. His tennis games vanished from the calendar. He drank more in public, his voice booming but hollow, like a man trying to convince himself he wasn't afraid. But fear has a smell. And every time I saw him, I could taste it thick in the air around him. One night, I decided to shove him harder. As he returned home, tired and unsteady on his feet, he found a package at his front porch. Not hidden. Not disguised. Just placed as if it belonged. Inside, nothing but broken glass and a single photograph, his own face cut out from an old interview clipping, taped onto an obituary page I'd pulled from the local paper. He screamed that night. I didn't hear it directly, but I saw the neighbors gather the next morning, whispering about shouting in the middle of the night. Imagine, David Kane, the man who once commanded rooms with his false charisma, shouting into the dark like a frightened rat. He started leaving lights on in every room of the house. Security guards rotated at his gate, but I noticed something they didn't. He still couldn't stop looking from window to window, like a child desperate to convince himself the dark held nothing sinister. But the dark did hold something. It held me. And I was patient. Because cornered rats don't just panic, they make mistakes. And I was waiting for David Kane's mistakes to finally rip the mask from his face for good. The night I decided to end it, Naples was quiet. The Gulf air hung heavy, thick with the scent of salt and hibiscus carried in from manicured lawns. His mansion sat still under the yellow wash of security lights, but inside, I could see him pacing through one window, his outline jerking back and forth like a marionette whose strings had frayed. David Kane wasn't untouchable anymore. He was unraveling. I waited until midnight before making my move. Wearing nothing more than black jeans, a sweatshirt, and gloves, I walked past the security guard's gate. They didn't stir. Because hours earlier, I'd tampered with their shift logs, making one guard think his partner had taken over too early, the other think his replacement was coming late. His fortress no longer had watchmen. I crossed the neatly clipped grass and stood at his glass patio doors. The house lights were still on, every window burned bright like a ship aflame. Kane's figure froze when he saw me. For the first time, I let him see my face. At first, he squinted like he didn't believe it, just another figure in his nightmares. Then his eyes widened, color draining from him. Recognition, not because he remembered me, but because he recognized what I stood for, every victim, every ruined family, every dream bled dry. I slid the glass door open. He didn't move. He just stared, lips parted, chest heaving. "Who are you?" His voice cracked. "Who sent you?" I stepped inside, the gleaming tiles silent under my shoes. "I'm no one," I said softly. "And I'm everyone." His throat bobbed. His hands curled into fists, then released as if even he knew fists wouldn't save him now. "You think you can scare me? I have money, lawyers." I cut him off with a laugh. Not sharp, not violent, just tired, almost pitying. "No, David. That's what you don't have anymore. You don't have money. You don't have allies. You don't have respect. You don't have control. I've taken it all from you. Piece by piece." His face darkened, some last flicker of ego fighting to push back. "What do you want? Money? Name your price." I stared at him then, not at the polished predator he once was in those glossy interviews, but at the shaking, sleepless man standing in his own gilded cage. "You already gave me what I wanted," I told him. "I wanted you to know what it feels like. To lose everything. To breathe despair every second of the day. To wake up wondering what else will be gone tomorrow." I stepped closer until I could see the sweat streaking down the side of his temple. "You stole my children's future. And now I've stolen yours." His mouth opened, no words came. For a long moment, there was just silence between us, the hum of the air conditioning filling the space like a dirge. Then I turned. Walked back through the glass doors. Outside, the night air hit me, cool and freeing. Behind me, I knew Kane would collapse into whatever was left of his pride, clutching at the ruins of a life that could never be rebuilt. Because I had made him taste what he'd fed us, day after excruciating day. By the time I reached my car, I didn't look back. There was no need. I had ended him, not with a gun, not with fire, but with the one weapon he could never defend against, the truth about himself. When I drove north the next morning, the sun spilling gold across the highway, I finally felt like I was carrying something more than grief. I was carrying my children's future. Not money, not guarantees, but something stronger, proof that their mother had refused to stay broken. Proof that even when the world fails to give you justice, you can carve it with your own bare hands. For the first time in years, when Ethan and Lily asked me how we would go on, I smiled honestly. We would go on free. Because the man who had haunted us was nothing now, nothing but a scarecrow of his former self, left behind in a mansion of shadows, with nothing but his ghosts for company. And I drove away knowing I had done what no court of law, no investigator, no savior ever could. I had given justice back to my children. And I would never let anyone take it from us again.